Hello, and welcome to the Washington Courts Report podcast, where I cover some of the most exciting news and programs from around the Washington state court system. I'm your host, Patric Haerle, and today we're here to discuss disability justice with the co-chair of the Disability Justice Task Force and first Supreme Court justice we've had on the show, Justice Helen Whitener, and staff member to the Disability Justice Task Force and senior court program analyst for the AOC, Joslyn Nelson. Joslyn, Justice Whitener, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. So for a little bit of context before we dive right in January 2022, the Washington State Supreme Court created the Disability Justice Task Force, the DJTF. The task force envisions a statewide court system where people with disabilities have access to justice that not only meets legal compliance, but also ensures dignity, equity, and full participation in the legal system and the profession. So just diving right in here, Justice Whitener, could you tell me a little bit about the Disability Justice Task Force and the study the group conducted?
Sure. We got funding, as you indicated, in 2022, but the work actually started right after I joined the Supreme Court in 2020, when I was approached by an AOC staff member, Robert Lichtenberg, and his request to me was, is there a way of us addressing disabilities and access issues a little differently and better for people with disabilities? Robert is deaf, right? And he had concerns in regards to language access and those types of things. So I had a discussion with our then Chief Supreme Court Justice Gonzalez. He was the chief at the time. And I discussed the issue with him because I am also a person with a disability, and it was known. That's why Robert approached me. He authorized me to start a task force to see if there is an issue in regards to our courts as a starting point. So it was initiated as a direct response to the complaints regarding meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities, especially those with non-apparent disabilities, intersecting identities, or those who face systemic barriers related to communication, such as Robert, poverty, which many of the individuals that encounter our courts are going through, and of course, building trust and confidence in the judiciary and the legal system we have here. The task force was put together to examine the accessibility of our courts for people with disabilities, but I did not want it to focus only on ADA compliance, but through a broader lens, more inclusive equity lens. So with support from the legislature, after 2 years with a steering committee on disabilities, we received funding to give us an opportunity to take a look at various courts in our system. Washington State does not have a unified court system. So with modest financing, we were able to engage all courts throughout the state from the lowest court level, municipal courts, all the way up here to the Supreme Court, and we covered urban and rural communities. The difficulty with getting the study done and a look at accessibilities addressed is because I wanted it to be broader than compliance, which is required. Robert retired from AOC, and I was lucky enough to get Joslyn Nelson, who has a great background and knowledge base in regards to disabilities. And in discussions with her, she realized I was conceptualizing and discussing my disabilities through disability justice. And I had no idea what that was about. So with her help, we expanded the framework for the study, and it was now focused on the court accessibility utilizing that disability justice model. And what that model does is it recognizes that formal rules alone don't guarantee access. The study focused on lived experiences and intersectionality, procedural equity, and court culture. And in other words, it centered around and was led by individuals with disabilities from a diverse spectrum of disabilities and disability community.
Joslyn, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Justice Whitener did a great job covering it. The disability justice framework and lens is what was utilized in courts. We had to kind of redefine a little bit of things to better fit within the court perspective and how we could utilize the lens. And so we modified the disability justice principles, which could be found on the website where it integrates into the courts and how courts can start utilizing that framework within the lens in order to maybe update their own policies and review all of those things. One of the things about the study that I think was fascinating, because we would always hear that, oh, courts don't like taking surveys, court professionals don't like them. They're always getting surveys. It's really hard. So for our first survey, it was for court professionals only. So judges, attorneys, any type of legal advocates, those types of individuals. And so we had over 650 court users respond, which is pretty unheard of for a court user survey. And so we got a lot of valuable information back from the courts themselves.
Yeah, and Patric, before we move on, that was really impressive because I realized as Joslyn educated us on the disability justice framework, we realize what it does is it meets people where they're at. It really values the individual, treats them with respect. Things that literally were being complained about, utilizing this framework would help alleviate some of that.
Yeah, there were a couple of great points raised there. I think meeting them at that level, like you said, is so important, and it clearly paid off. Getting 650 responses is incredibly impressive for a survey like this. And Jocelyn had a great mention there that in our show notes and in the description, we will link to the Disability Justice Task Force website and including the study that was mentioned, where the website has a lot of great materials, including that statement of principles mentioned before. So one thing I know we wanted to make clear is this study wasn't just a regular compliance report. Jocelyn, could you touch a little bit on how this study differed from something like a disability compliance report a court might run?
So when disability compliance, we look at physical assessments, digital assessments. We look at the overall were accommodations provided. So that's what a compliance report will look at. Measurements. This was a little different because we know that it had a little bit of essential. So there's a small part in the study that does talk about compliance, but overall we wanted people's experiences. So, and that is what the compliance reports don't really capture, and so they don't capture the biases and the language and the difficulty somebody has accessing the courts, because let's say they're in poverty and they can't make it to courts, the forms aren't accessible, they can't be read, there's plain language, too many legalese. It was also examined, the bias and the stigma, which compliance reports rarely if ever address. With over 40% of the respondents, they said they feared that they would be treated differently if they asked for an accommodation. So it measured disclosure issues. It measured all of these systemic issues that people with disabilities wind up facing. But on top of that, we examined all the intersectional pieces. So we looked at race, class, gender, language, and trauma as part of the study of accessing courts. And so it wasn't just compliance, because compliance can't measure those situations in courts. They cannot give a voice behind it. They can't really look at the whole picture.
And Patric, what that means is the court was operating, the compliance model is the ADA model, and it's looking at more the structural accessibility issues. Do you have a ramp? How wide is the door? Those sorts of things. What I learned is the disability justice lens applied to accessibility within the courts, and this was the first of its kind sort of report and study done, looks at language, how language is being used, not just language access, like do you need an interpreter, but how language is being used when you communicate with someone. So on the website, we do have a report that Joslyn put together regarding language inclusivity in regards to language. It also looked at how we deal with accommodation requests within our courts, which again isn't captured with an ADA compliance lens. So those are the things that made it different and made it more encompassing and more inclusive in how we approach and what we receive from the report. Finally, this was done. So it's not the deep dive that we really would love to do. This was done with a budget in a state trying to cover all the courts, all different levels, how they handle accessibility issues in regards to disability, and how we can assist them in making changes. We couldn't do it all, not with the funding we had. So we did the best that we could to get an idea, and it was very insightful what came out of it.
I'd like to highlight an example if I could. We weren't able to do all the courts. Some courts didn't feel that they wanted to put their information out there, which we totally completely respect that. So every court had were able to participate if they chose to, but we did some of the physical assessments. And there are some areas, and I think Justice Whitener knows what all I'm going to be bringing up, that was just flooring. And even though I've worked in the disability realm, there's still things that surprise me and take my breath away. And one of our researchers, they went to a courthouse in a more of a rural area in Washington, and they did their audit, their physical assessment. And on the third floor, the only fire escape was on the third floor out the window. And you had to cross an AC unit in order to even assess the window. And so what that means is that people with disabilities had no way to be removed if there was a fire danger.
Yeah,
Additionally, the fire escape ladder didn't meet all the way down to the ground, so there was still a section where you had to drop.
exactly.
And and here we are, 2025, and still looking at these things.
And another example too was signage. Something as simple as changing the sign or placement for the disability device at the door was so high in some locations that someone in a wheelchair couldn't even access it, and it was for them. So it was very eye-opening what we learned from this study.
Additionally, in this study, and I want to highlight one portion that we were very careful with, is there is a section there for Native Americans. The focus group was ran for and reviewed by Wazihaska Cook over in South Dakota. And so there is explicit information to show how these Native Americans access courts and even travel courts, and how they might not be accessible and walking in between two worlds. And so we really wanted to highlight intersectionality as the focus.
Exactly. And, you asked, how does the study differ from something like a compliance report? It is it's the first of its kind. There's no court in the United States that has looked at accessibility issues regarding disability utilizing the disability justice lens. Most courts who do some sort of report utilize an ADA compliance approach. And that's understandable. That's all they had for the longest while. So I think that's a highlight that came out of us doing it this way.
Yeah, and I do want to highlight, while Justice Whitener mentioned this study is not all-encompassing, should not be undersold in any way. This is a first of its kind, as you said. It is over 600 pages. It is absolutely real progress being made in this area. And for those who want to check it out and look into it, I do highly recommend it. There's a great introduction with a foreword and an executive summary and an abstract if the whole document is a little too intimidating. That also includes an overview of the 10 principles of disability justice. There's literature review, there's data review, there's a physical assessment of courthouses, there's a web accessibility audit, there's focus groups, interviews, and surveys that were conducted, as we've mentioned, and then it ends with some recommendations based on study findings. So it really is a pretty encompassing survey. So congratulations on completing that. A report, not a survey, I should say. Congratulations on completing that. And it is really a great resource for Washington courts, I feel.
I agree, totally. Um, Disability is something that really touches all of us at some point in our lives. We may not think we have a disability, but it depends on how you view or define disability, and anything that affects your ability to function is a disability. So most individuals think of disability as someone in a wheelchair or, those sorts of things. We saw disability as not just being physical, not just being visible. You have a number of people maneuvering through this world with disabilities that you just cannot tell by looking at them. We tried to cover cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities, language access. I know I'm missing some. Joslyn, you can jump in. But we tried the best that we could to find as many as we could and try to identify what issues they may have using our courts and what are some of the holes in the system that we can try and address to make it better.
And
Another aspect that we looked at that's a little bit unique is that we also took the viewpoint of those who haven't disclosed or those who still don't know they're disabled,
Mm,
um, or haven't got the proper diagnosis because that costs money. And so there's many people operating in this world who still don't have a formal diagnosis.
mhm.
And so we took that into account when we looked at everything too.
yeah, it's so important taking the multiple views of the perspective. I think you mentioned earlier the different lenses are so important for this. And one thing I wanted to make sure gets touched on is this study was really broad and had a lot going into it and a lot it hoped to accomplish. To you, if you had to summarize it, how would you say what were the major goals of this study? What does the task force hopes to come from this study, really, if it is a success? What would you view as a success here?
Since it's seen as a Supreme Court task force study, I think it's important that we understand that Washington has a non-unified court system, meaning we can say from the Supreme Court, this is what we want done, and courts can decide not to do it. So the approach is to get buy-in, which is why we reached out to all the courts throughout the state. The model I saw Joslyn use was a unified, universal change in regards to engaging, having the court learn how to engage with people with disabilities. So, raising awareness, fostering discussions and education is important. Utilizing lived experiences. So, we really understand what the individuals who are impacted are going through by giving them a voice at the table in the decision making process. So that was my hope and my goal in regards to it. I just want to see our courts treat and engage with people. In this instance, people with disabilities more respectfully, um, seeing the person where they're at, engaging with the person in a more respectful manner, and learning, continuing to learn how to be better at what we do in the legal system. Jocelyn, your perspective is a little different as well.
My perspective is a little different, as a person with disability, as a court user, as spending my time also training on people on disability justice, which I've done throughout most of my career at universities and other state agencies. Is we need to see individuals with disabilities as humans that operate within a justice system, so that we still have this misconception that when someone is disabled, they can't possibly want families, they can't possibly,
Hmm.
have careers and these things. And it was to change how we view people with disabilities as just a part of society. And so that is one of the hopes to come through this, is because we directly heard from parents and court users and veterans, Native Americans, and how their experiences were with the courts. And it was solely because around disabilities and others who were misunderstood or coerced during hearings. And so that was something else that was brought up, was when we don't understand language and disability, there was a lot of false confessions that could be happening, a lot of misunderstandings. And so we wanted the justice system to see that this isn't a compliance. And so that was the take from the study, is it's a multiple approach that people with disabilities have families. So they're not one-off stories. They were a reveal of the systematic harm that was being made when we don't take a couple of extra seconds. One thing from the study that came out glaringly was GR33 is a mess.
Well, tell them
And
what
that was repeated
GR33
over and
is.
over. You can go ahead and do that, Justice Whitener, but
Well,
yeah, touch a little bit on that one.
GR33 is the court rule, the general rule that the court utilizes when someone who has a disability requests accommodations. And it just requires that we address their accommodations if we can. So, reasonable accommodations. It doesn't guarantee accommodations. It's the qualifier is reasonable accommodations. And what Joslyn um, is discussing is, for example, we through GR33 require documentation of a disability. And there are so many issues regarding that devalues a person, because you're asking them to disclose their medical condition by bringing medical documentation of it. And the disability justice lens literally is requires that you eliminate that and have ask the person, how can we accommodate you today? And have them tell you what they need. And then you, the court, make a determination based on what you have, whether or not you can meet that need in making your decision as to whether you can provide accommodation or not. But requiring documentation from the individual, and there are also some privacy concerns that we realized through this study, that Joslyn has already proposed rule changes. And I know I reviewed the last set that she sent to me, but I think we're almost finished. Where are you at with that, Joslyn? And if you can just let them know.
Yeah, so we're proposing a massive rehaul over GR33 and adding an additional paragraph within the GR31, which is protection of what's up for public disclosure. So what it makes is, the proposal in GR31 is that disability accommodation requests are not up for public disclosure, unless your attorney or something to that effect, but they can't be used against you, because that was a fear, a repetitive fear that came out of the study. And GR33 also looks at more procedural situations, because court admins were like, I don't know how to use this. I don't know how to apply this effectively. So all of the final draft is done and it's been submitted, and it will go under court rule review on the committee. So the rules committee on November 10th.
And that process is likely to take over a year, but at least we have gotten it in and the process should start. So that was a really important part of the work as well.
Yeah, exciting progress to be sure. Those are important changes that you mentioned, that, sometimes these things need major overhauls to make sure access to justice is happening. And that segues really well into my next question that I'll start with Justice Whitener on. What is next for the Disability Justice Task Force, if anything?
Funding. We're trying to get funding because we would love to get a commission to address these issues. You have to understand, if we are not addressing these issues, we can leave ourselves wide open for liability. So it helps everyone and it behooves everyone if we can figure this thing out by doing a more detailed research and getting more courts and different layers covered. We've already started the GR33 and GR31 rule change, as you know, and we would really try to have different recommendations that came out of the study started since we don't have funding right now, but we're doing it. We're doing a lot of education. Just this morning, we did a video in regards to disability and systemically excluded individuals and disability for the Office of Equity, the governor's Office of Equity. So that's how we're approaching it right now, Patrick. Education. And I know the chief is very supportive, Chief Deborah Stevens, and she's trying to see if we can include it in our budget request to the legislature, to the governor, I believe. So that's what's next. We're trying.
Yeah, it all comes down to funding, unfortunately,
yeah.
doesn't it? Joslyn, really quickly, did you have anything to add to that?
No, what I want to add is that it was an equity series that we're doing. So we started that in the beginning of October and it runs through November through the Office of Equity. And it's just kind of building that interconnecting branching that we need because the courts are so siloed. And honestly, we are the last resort. We're the last step. When people have reached the courts, they've already gone through several different agencies, several different processes, other systems. And so at this point, it's how do we start working together for just equity in general and making sure that the courts remain the last stop and hopefully that we can provide better services. And so the executive branch has been pretty interested in the work that we're doing to see how we can start working together to make sure that we can start eliminating some of these situations.
And the legislative branch as well.
Oh, and the legislative branch too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's exciting news, and that's a good positive note to end on for sure. I want to thank you both, Joslyn and Justice Whitener, for coming on the show and shedding some light on this important issue. It is Disability Awareness Month, I believe, so it is timely as well. So that's great to hear. Is there any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us off on, or people you'd like to shout out as we end the episode? Justice Whitener, we can start with you.
Well, Chief Justice Deborah Stevens, is committed to supporting the work. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Justice Stephen Gonzalez. He was chief at the time. Dawn Marie Rubio, who is the state court administrator of the AOC, the Administrative Office of the Court, has been very supportive of the work as well. She'd like to see a more inclusive court system. We'd like to thank the task force and the steering committee members who volunteered their time over years. Robert Lichtenberg for approaching me when I joined the court. And I cannot thank Joslyn enough for all of the work that she has done and continues to do to try and help us get to the dream that we have for disability access and how we treat individuals within our courts.
Well said. Joslyn, anything to add?
Oh yes, I am grateful for the individuals from the executive branch who are also on our task force who took the time out of their day and the extra work that they've had to do. But also I am grateful for people who shared their lived experience. It was not easy. They trusted us with their stories. They trusted us to handle the information in the way that was going to impact the courts. The public defenders who spoke with us, because we also did interviews, one-on-one interviews with individuals, and the ADA coordinators who were trying desperately to do what they can in the courts with the little, sometimes support that are given or understanding, because sometimes they're wearing two roles, two hats, admin and ADA. So it is a lot of work that they're taking on to try to make it through the system. And I think the other thing is to think about is disability justice means shifting how courts think, not just what they do. So we can shift in how we're thinking and applying these things and applying this lens, it will really solidify in how we actually have the full picture. And that's what I am really wanting individuals to do is, do you have the full picture in front of you? If not, what questions should you be asking?
Well said.
Yeah, agreed completely. I think that is an important note to end on. Absolutely shifting the way we think is getting that full picture is so important. So again, I want to thank you both for coming on the show today, and you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Patrick.